Today I have the privilege of interviewing Dr. Rowley Richards, former medical officer for the 2nd 15th Field Regiment, who during the Second World War was involved in the fall of Singapore, the construction of the railway in Burma, and subsequently, until the end of the hostilities, was in Japan. And thank you, Rowley, for agreeing to do this interview. It's much appreciated. And if I could ask by just a little bit of background, where you were born and educated.
I was born in Sydney, Summerhill, and I first of all went to an infant school, which was at WW2, which was a mile or two away from home. Then went to Petersham Primary School, Summerhill Intermediate High School, and Foot Street High School.
And where did you do your medical studies?
At Sydney University, commencing in 1934.
Now, I'm aware that many graduates of Sydney University went and joined the Sydney University Regiment. How is it that you became, in your own right, an artillery officer?
Well, the same year that I commenced at the university, I was persuaded, or I was influenced by two of my closest friends, a Des Makepeace and a Sid Smith, who'd already joined the Artillery Survey Company, and they knew of my interest in maths, and I felt they suggested that I should join them, which I did in early 1934. In fact, I put my age up so I could go into camp with them in the Easter camp, and I was terrified for years that somebody would catch up with the fact and then I'd be court-martialed and shot, which didn't happen. The real reason for joining the militia outside the SUR was the fact that I realised that if I joined the SUR, I would be going into camp with the people that I would be with all the time. And I felt it was important that I was involved with people that who were going to be my patients, ultimately.
Please.
And that it was important to learn about the average Joe Blow rather than the academic. And apart from my interest in maths, the other thing that did interest me a little was the fact that we were paid, and it helped the petty cash.
Now, what date did you go to Singapore, and when you were there, where were you deployed?
Well, we started off in Singapore in August 1941. And we started off in a place called Nee Soon, which was on the island of Singapore. We were only there for a short period. And then we went up to a place called Tam Pin, which was not far from Malacca, which was on the coast. And we did our jungle training there. And at that stage, I should go back, we started off as an artillery regiment with 18 pounders and 4-5 hours. On pre-embarkation leave, our guns were withdrawn and we were issued with 3-inch mortars. And being good gunners, the thought of using mortars was horrifying, as you can imagine. And we spent a lot of time on the ship going over, planning deployment and for the troops to learn how to use the thing. And then we had to, in the early days in Malaya, do procedures for tactical exercises and all that sort of thing, which was contrary to what we had joined up for, should we say. And we didn't actually get our 25-pounder guns until literally we were on our way to battle stations. And in fact, we went into action with both 25-pounders and 3-inch mortars.
Thank you. And following the fall of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942, you must have spent some time in the Changi area. I assume you did. And at what stage were you selected to become a medical officer on A Force?
Obviously, February 15th was the capitulation. It was about May, I think, beginning of May, when headquarters were told that they were to supply 3,000 troops to go to destination unknown, where things were going to be nice and comfortable, the food was going to be good and the climate was good. Of course, there were lots of rumours as to being exchanged and being repatriated and all that sort of thing. We would have learned, of course, it was different. The selection was largely a matter from headquarters. They told each unit how many they were to prepare, how many they were to supply. And in fact, A Force was formed of 3 battalions. The 1st battalion was commanded by George Ramsey, and it was mainly infantry. The 3rd battalion was commanded by Major Green from Western Australia, and they were mainly machine gunners. The number 2 battalion, which was the one I was attached to, commanded by Colonel Anderson, Charles Anderson, BC, was made up of the so-called specialists, artillery, engineers, SIGs, and half a CCS. And the selection was, as I say, made by, or the distribution was determined by headquarters, and each of the units were told to provide so many troops.
Thank you. Now, when you were operating in Burma, can you tell me a little bit about people such as Thomas Hamilton and Colonel Eadie and
Colonel Hamilton was in charge of the CCS. Actually, he was the commander of the 2nd Force CCS, and he was in command of the half CCS, which was in number 2 battalion, commanded by Colonel Anderson. Tom Hamilton was a character. He was, I was going to say, inoffensive, but I'm sure that he did the best that he felt that was possible to do. And Colonel Eadie, of course, came from Java and was attached to Williams Force as their medical officer. The Williams Force was from the Middle East, if you remember, and Norman Eadie, who was an ear, nose and throat specialist, was attached to them. And he was an older man, was not, I was going to say, an RMO type. He was essentially a hospital type.
in other words, a difficult job to do.
He was what we used to call a doctor in uniform.
Yes. And what about Bill Drower?
Bill Drower was an incredible guy. He was our interpreter, was attached to us as an interpreter. He was a Brit. He knew that troops used to laugh and call him a Pobby Dill, and he still, when he writes to me, signs of the pommy dill or something along those lines. He had a lovely sense of humour. He had an incredibly difficult job because he was the meat in the sandwich. On one side, he had to do the best he could for us, and on the other side, he had to do the best he could for the Japs to keep them quiet.
Yes.
And as such, I gave him full marks.
Now, I'm told by a friend of mine in Western Australia by the name of Phil Bealby, who carried a clarinet with him up the line, that he was in the same camp as you.
That's right. He was a Navy boy, I think. Was he?
No, he was a second fourth machine gun.
Oh, was he?
Yeah. Arthur Bancroft was the...
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And I think you did mention to me earlier that you were aware of someone playing a clarinet in the lines from time to time.
Oh, yes. Just, we were starved for music. And in the early days, when we were in Taboy, in Burma, we used to have concerts. And some of the band, I think they were, they one of the battalions came away, I think George Ramsey's group came away with a band, with their instruments and all that sort of stuff. And anybody who could play anything that was better than a tuneless Japanese flute, which is about the only thing that we heard, was very welcome.
Did you come across Bob Skilton at any time?
I don't remember that.
His son was later a Brownlow medalist in the Victorian football, and he apparently had a wonderful voice.
No.
Now, the Force, Williams Force and Anderson Force were line layers.
Yes.
So you were actually at the joining of the rails on the 17th of October 1942.
We were indeed. We were in camp at a place called Niki, which was from Tambuziet, as they call it now, 131 kilometres, and the line was actually joined at 154 kilometres. But from the Burma side, the troops who were physically engaged in that were from our camp at Niki.
Yes. Now, once the work was completed on the line, where did you go to in the southern end of the line prior to being selected with the Japan Party?
We went to a place called Talakam, where we occupied a camp that had been built by the Brits, by Colonel Tuesday, I think. It was an incredible place. They had their poultry farms and vegetable gardens and God knows what. And it was right near the so-called bridge on the River Kwai, where they originally built a wooden bridge, and then they built the steel bridge, so that they were well established, and they'd been there for a long time. Discipline was very tough. They even had their own guardhouse. But there were a couple of Australians doctors there, Arthur Moon and Ewan Corlett. And they met us when we arrived and gave us money, and because our Burmese currency was useless in Thailand. But more importantly, they gave us a ruddy great feed. More food than we'd seen for heaven knows when.
Now, when you're on the Burma end, you must have had some assistance from Medical Orderlies. Are there any that come readily to mind?
Oh, certainly. I mean, they were my life. I had a sergeant, Jim Armstrong, who was older than most. He was known as Old Silver because of his white hair. And because of my youthful appearance, I was known as the baby doctor. But he was magnificent. all the way, all the time. We had a corporal, Pinky Rhodes, Pinky because he had red hair. He was one whom I had originally trained in Australia before we left. Well, going back a stage, the normal established for a regiment was to have a regimental medical orderly who was a corporal, and that was it. I had a friend, John Lowenthal, who finished up as Sir John. He was Dean of the Faculty of Medicine, Sydney University. He was the 2nd 9th Field Regiment, and he had established what he called battery medical orderlies, which was not according to establishment. And we had 2 batteries in those days. Subsequently, we had 3 batteries. And I thought that this was a brilliant idea and carried it a stage further. And there were 2 troops per battery. There were 3 troops for each of the 2 batteries, so there were 6 troops. I trained troop medical orderlies. The way I did that was to, I was going to say con the CO, because the battery commanders were most unhappy, but I took 70 men from right across the regiment and trained them in first aid. We did a week's training, or 5 days, and we covered the Army first aid, we covered the St John Ambulance first aid, and 60 of them, in fact, qualified for St John certificates. Now, these people formed, I was going to say, the nucleus of a medical establishment within the regiment, so that on every gun we had one of the gunners who was a medical orderly, every OPIP, every kitchen, everywhere, so that we were well equipped. Now, the best of those we then trained further, and they became the troop medical orderlies and the battery medical orderlies. Subsequently, we went to 3 batteries, each of 2 troops, and we had corporals on establishment for each of the batteries, but not for the troops. That they were regular gunners who did their gunner job, and then if anybody was hurt, they did whatever they had to do. One of the jobs of and I think this is important, one of the jobs of the troop medical orderlies was to be responsible for all the men in his troop. And every morning, as they came out of the shower, he had his nominal roll there, and he would tick them off. He'd check their skin, and he had a kit, and he was able to treat the minor things. And if they didn't settle down within a day or 2, they'd be sent up to the RAP. I guess what I was flat out doing was doing myself out of a job, and it worked extremely well.
Now, equipment and medications that were available to you went on the line. Did you have things like forceps, scalpels?
Well, we started off remembering that we were pretty well equipped when we left Singapore.
Oh.
We were, unlike all the other parties that left after we did, we were, as I say, well organised, well equipped. And I had my own personal kit. We had a pannier, a big army pannier full of equipment and stores, which the Japs looted, and we lost pretty well all of it. We did, however, still retain what I'd carried personally, what my medical orderlies had carried personally, and so that we weren't completely devoid of equipment nor medical supplies.
Have you got any examples of improvisation that people came up with?
Oh, numerous. There was one fellow who put an axe into the base of his thumb and straight through the bone. And we stitched that all up. And then it was necessary to have what we called a banjo splint, which was essentially a piece of heavy wire which was shaped much like that, secured around the wrist, and then you could put traction on the thumb by tying bits of string or something or other. We had a number of people who were first class at providing these things. It was a case of saying, hey Bill, we need so-and-so. Well, when do you need it? Not a case of, oh gee, I don't think we can do that. It was, obviously we can fix it for you. We had another fellow who was a surgical instrument maker. And he carried this great catalogue with him, big thing. And every now and again he'd come along and say, by the way, he'd retained his files and various other making instruments. And he'd come along with a piece of steel that he would have knocked off from a truck or somewhere. And say, well, now, I could make this for you, I could make that for you, what would you like? On another occasion, the spikes which were used to attach the rail to the sleepers were of poor quality metal, as were the hammers that they used, and pieces of them used to fly off like shrapnel and bury themselves in the lower leg. And they'd be buried an inch or 2 inches into the calf or wherever. You could see the point of entry, but it was difficult to get them out. And so this fellow, this instrument maker, I told him what the problem was, what I would like, and he finished up by making a pair of forceps. The end of the forcep was made into a loop, and a loop on either side, so that we'd use the closed forcep as a probe, which we'd put down into the wound, and then as soon as we could attach the metal, we'd open it up, take it a little bit further, and then capture the piece of metal into the loop and extract it, which was very great. And this, incidentally, was one of the spikes that I recently was presented with while on the trip to Thailand and Burma. And you can see that metal is very poor quality, and it was easy for it to flake off. But that was, there were numerous other examples of improvisation of a medical type. We had no amputations, therefore we didn't have any need for prostheses. But some of the other camps, of course, they were most ingenious with their prostheses that they were able to make. The cooks, if we were in camp for any length of time, would make ovens. They'd get mud bricks and cook them and make ovens, which were very effective. Even hot water service, which is another story. It's a long and involved story, but there were constantly examples of ingenuity.
Did you? I know there's a Dutchman by the name of Van Boxtell that worked with Albert Coates.
That's right.
Did you have any contact with Van Boxtell?
I knew him, I would have met him, but he was in another camp. He was in the headquarters camp with Bertie Coates. Bertie, incidentally, was one of those who came up from Java or Sumatra at the same time as William's force. Van Boxtell was a most incredible guy. He could make... he made emmetine out of ipecac wine or tincture of ipecac, and so it went on. They were extraordinary people.
Yes.
And incidentally, you mentioned Bertie Coates. There have been many of the doctors on the railway have been lauded, but in my opinion, he was the greatest. He was a First World War man. He was full of initiative, never dropped his muzzle. He kept the morale of the troops very high and did a magnificent job.
Yeah, I did read that at one stage when he wasn't well, he did his ward rounds on a stretcher.
Oh, that's correct, yeah.
Now, when you were down in the vicinity of Tamarkan and you were chosen for the Japan party, what was your route for getting to your vessels in Singapore?
Well, initially, we went to Saigon, through Bangkok, and then down the river and channels or whatever. We went to Saigon, and we were there for 3 months. And we joined a British group that had been there all the time. They had wooden huts with electricity, and they'd had a lot of contact with the local French, and they finished up with a very sizable orchestra. And when the Japs asked them, "Where'd you get that?" "Oh, we brought it from Japan, from Singapore with it." But obviously they were getting them over the fence. And I learned a very, very good lesson. After a few days, this was after the railway was finished, after a few days, the British officers from that camp came over to us and said, "Well, now, will you stop your troops telling absolute lies about their experience on the railway? There's no way in the world that what they're saying could be true." And I realised then that if fellow prisoners couldn't appreciate the story, there's no way in the world that you or anybody else who had not been there could possibly understand what we're talking about. And I'm reminded of the old proverb which says, "If you have not supped from the same cup, you cannot know the taste." And that was very apparent there.
Now,
from Saigon, you asked how do we get to Singapore?
Thank you.
From Saigon, we made 2 attempts to get on ships there, but it was considered to be far too dangerous to go by or to leave Saigon because the submarines were very active. So we finished up having to retrace our steps through Bangkok, then down the railway to Singapore.
In the same luxury accommodation?
Oh, yeah.
The
Oh, yeah.
daily trips come up?
Trucks, steel trucks with 32 per truck.
Yes.
Squatting room only.
Now, how long were you in Singapore before embarking for Japan?
Roughly 3 months on a little island called Palo Damala, which was off on the southern, just off the southern coast of the island of Singapore, where the troops built a graving dock. And we were there, as I say, for 3 months before we finally embarked on our way to Japan. As far as I'm concerned, the main claim to fame for this island, which we call Jeep Island after the little third-class Japanese private who was our guard, nicknamed the Jeep. It was on that island that I buried a summary of my diary, which I had kept, and it was recovered 2.5 years later and returned to me. And it formed the basis of the survival factor of the book which I put.
Now, I'd intend to gloss over, the events of the torpedoing of the convoy, because I don't think we've got time to cover that. It's a subject of its own, unless there's some particular aspect you want to deal with there.
Yeah, I think that one of the important things of the sinking was that the officers concerned, the Australian, there were 5 or 6, had worked out a system of evacuation of a ship in the event, and when it happened, the whole thing was done in a very orderly manner. We got our sick off without hurting anybody. They got on rafts and things, and then after we'd got everybody off, and there were a couple of us who stayed behind and found that the Japs, who immediately shot through as soon as the torpedo hit us, and they left 2 lifeboats still on the ship. We tried to ship one, but the davits were rusted and we couldn't get anywhere with it. We managed to get the second one off. In launching it, we damaged it, but it didn't alter the fact that we were able to collect about 60, I estimated, who hung on. They could get relief hanging on in the water. And there would be a few on board who would do the bailing because of the leak in the bottom of the ship, of the boat. The Rakyuo Maru, which is a ship, did not go down for 24 hours. I'm sorry, for over 12 hours. And late in the afternoon, before it finally went down, the Japs sent a couple of destroyers in to pick up the Japs who were in lifeboats. So we pushed our lifeboat over in among them and took over the empty lifeboats. And we were able to finished up with 12 lifeboats. One of which decided to go for the Philippines, and the rest of us were on our way to China. It was only going to take about 10 or 12 days in our calculation to get to China. But that didn't worry anybody.
No. Now, if your experience whilst you're in Japan, in your camp, did you develop any affinity with any of the Japanese guards, or?
Certainly not the guards. They were a milder breed than the ones we'd been used to on the railway, because most of the really bad ones on the railway were Koreans. According to the Japs, they were let out of prison in Korea to join the army, to become guards for POWs. There were, however, when we got there, we became a labour force, which was, I was going to say, rented to local factories, to local businesses, Japanese businesses. And they, as civilians, were responsible for feeding us, providing us with medical care, etc. And attached to our camp was a little Japanese who had suffered polio as a kid and was quite deformed in one leg. He was not young, and he was the so-called medical orderly who was responsible for maintaining the figures, providing us with supplies and all that sort of thing. And he was a great little bloke. He used to come along with his bento box, which is their lunch box, with little compartments in it, with rice, beef, and whatever. And he would share it with the sick in hospital. And post-war, I used to send him food parcels from friends of mine who were in Bangkok working in Japan. We maintained contact. And in 1959, I had the opportunity of going to Japan with an Australian Army group, and we were able to visit him. The other civilian was the local butcher, Takahashi, who was very good to us. When a horse skidded on the ice and broke its leg, they had to put it down, of course, and go to the abattoirs where he would use our men as labour to skin it and section it. And there were 4 groups within the town that were each entitled to 1 quarter, so that he had to finish up with 4 quarters. The way he did this was to section the beast transversely and then go down a couple of ribs and section it again, so that there was a whole circle of meat which went under the counter. Then he'd split the other 2 bits so that he had 2 forequarters and he had 2 hindquarters. And the local Japs were happy, and of course he provided a good meat meal for the troops. He did this at great risk to himself, but he was one that we used to send food parcels to also, and who we were very pleased to meet after the war.
Now, I'm aware that you've written a book and the topic of it is the survival factor. But could you summarise, in general terms, how people did survive the experience of the railway?
There's no simple answer. No simple answer. These days they would say it's multifactorial. There are a number of factors which were of paramount importance. One, and the most important, I believe, was mateship. Now, mateship was something which was, I was going to say, characteristically Australian. And the Brits and the Americans used to look on with and wonder at this incredible mateship that existed among the Australians. And I've many times said that I never saw a sick Australian who didn't have somebody to look after him. Courage was another very important factor. We think of courage in the heat of battle, or somebody taking over a machine gun post or something like that. I see courage every bit as important to somebody who cold-bloodedly will volunteer as a medical orderly. Now, I mentioned earlier that we had trained medical orderlies, but there were periods when even they couldn't cope, such as during the cholera epidemic, whatever. And there would always be somebody who would be prepared to volunteer to look after his mates who were sick. Another important factor was the ability of the Australian to innovate. and we talked about improvisation, and that was a very, very important factor. And you've got to remember that probably half of our men were bushies, and all they need is a bit of fencing wire and a pair of pliers, and they'll fix whatever's broken with what's available. And even the city cousins were pretty useful also. Remembering also that this was shortly after the Depression, and people had learnt to be pretty independent and self-reliant as a result of their experience. Sense of humour, I think, was a very important factor. And even in the worst of circumstances, there'd always be a voice up the back with some witty remark. And that was characteristic again of the Australians.
Well, Rowley, thank you very, very much for allowing me to have this interview with you. And thank you to your wife, Beth, for accepting me into your home today.
You're very
I'm
welcome.
sure it's not without some inconvenience.
Yeah, not at all. It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Good.